Good morning to you, one and all. We are live on the fifth connection on this 15th day of November. It is Friday morning, and I trust that you got up with a jump in your step, not a stepless step. Theo, I trust you jumped out of bed this morning. It's
There are
Friday
only
morning.
10 days left before it's payday, so these are the kind of priorities I have.
There's going to be more months at the end of
Heaven
the
will
paycheck.
come down
Don't worry.
and glory will fill my soul.
Good to have you, Theo.
It's good, always good to be here.
Yep. We are looking at the unfolding story in the book of Colossians that has to do with what wising up looks like. Wisdom is such a lost commodity these days because we don't have wise elders around. I'm not talking about elders, I'm talking about wise elders. That's a big ask. It's a real big ask. Where are the sages? Well, Colossians is talking us through what the personification of wisdom looks like. When somebody wises up, they will showcase skillful living in chapter 1. They will avoid pitfalls. They will shun senseless living. And now in chapter 3 and chapter 4 of the story, part 3 and 4, Paul is going to talk to us about the postures that go with seizing the skill sets for living right, for living life skillfully, being able to navigate our lives. And he is coming out of chapter 3, verse number 17, because in verse 17 he talks about whatever you do in word or deed, do everything. Elke dingetjie, elke kleine ou dingetjie, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks. And those lines are so loaded. Giving thanks. Verse 16, with thanks. End of verse 15, be thankful. And so the rule of God is what Paul is unpacking here. One who navigates life skillfully understands the importance of seizing this skill set, the skill sets that are needed to navigate life around the home, that's parentally, around the marriage, maritally, around rearing our kids, and around our jobs, vocationally. Does the rule of God show? It says in verse number 15, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. There it is. Rule. And when that happens in our lives, it happens together with the word of Christ being at home in our hearts, being at home in our lives. Verse 16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Find that idea of dwelling, finding a resting place. If we tell our visitors, or we are the host, we would say to our guests, make yourself at home. Is the word of God at home in our lives? Or are we constantly throwing the word aside and then trying to live our lives separately from the impact of the scriptures? Well, what comes out of our hearts goes to God at the end of verse 16. Right? We are singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs in our hearts. But what comes out from our lips, what comes out of our mouths, is directed toward other believers. And that's why the Ephesians 4 edification model has to do with a bodybuilding model where believers are mutually encouraging each other when they assemble. We spend so little time doing that, if any, in our assemblies. We have so-called worship on a Sunday morning, and all of that is to God, right? And there is an aspect which is correct according to verse 16. But there's a whole nother sphere which we have lost over the centuries. It's teaching and admonishing one another, instruction and admonition, warning each other, warning one another in all wisdom. So there's that duality, that dual aspect. Praising God in our hearts, but encouraging, teaching, instructing, admonishing each other. It's directed horizontally. So there's a very strong horizontal element in verse number 16. And that's why Paul can break out in verse number 18 when he addresses uh, the marriage, the husband and the wife in the marriage. The question on the floor is, how does God's rule show in the marital relationship? In your marriage, how does it show? Are you, as a husband, giving yourself to your wife sacrificially, looking out for her interests, irregardless of the cost to me? Now, that is a big one, gents. It has to it has to do with giving your life for your wife, willing to give your life for your wife. And I would say, after 42 years of marriage, that if you want to love your wife the way Christ loves and loved the church, it's going to cost you your life. It won't only cost you your pocketbook, your money, your time, your energy. It will cost you your very life. Wives, arrange yourself under the influence of your husbands. Submit to your husbands. That's a Submission is a 10-letter word, and many wives choke on that one. But as women who own the Lord, they are doing what is fitting in the Lord. They will arrange themselves under the provision and the protection of their husbands. Now he's going to shift on to what it looks like for the kids. What does the rule of God look like when it shows up in the life of a child and then in the life of a dad? Now let's just bring the gears down here, because I think so often we go through these passages so quickly. Let's just slow down the plane here. It says in verse 20, children, obey your parents in everything. Now, of course, the reference here to children is the word tekna, ta tekna. Children, those who are under your roof, or the minors under your roof. Children, obey your parents in everything. Now, some of us were reared in homes where we were told that you only submit to parents if they know Jesus. Right? So if they're saved, then you are obligated to obey them. This text is a lot more broad than that. Obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. The obedience in everything pleases the Lord. And very often parents need to decide what is immaturity, actions of immaturity, versus actions of rebellion. And not to confuse the two, because a child will do immature things. But I'd like to park here a bit, because I think for children, maybe who have come of age, they're a little older, they're 18 and over, and there will come times in a child's life when everything would need to be re-looked at, right? Because what happens to a child who's come of age and who's living in an abusive home? These kids are being beat up within an inch of their life. And do believing parents beat up on their kids and beat them within an inch of their life? Well, I suggest to you, welcome to the real world, because this does happen. abusive homes create abusive kids. And abusive kids will gravitate to abusing others and be abused by others. These are tough areas. The cycle of abuse in our country is horrifying. It defies description. I've taught in a high school for many, many years. And to watch how kids get brutalized in homes, and it's just horrific, too horrible even to speak about. But there are issues that we need to look at. And here the word is to children. Children, obey your parents in everything. Well, if there's an abusive situation, they need to find shelter. They need to find a safe space. That's why we need to be in touch in our believing communities, in our assembly life. Be so in touch with people that God has given into our care that we can spot these things. But there's a second area I want to touch on when it comes to children obeying parents. And that is that there will come times in the life of a child where that child will need to decide between what the will of the parents are or desires of the parents are for their life, for the child's life, versus what God's will for the child's life is. Now, I would say 9 times out of 10, parental approval is crucial across general issues and specific issues, such as issues in dating, such as issues of marriage. But I would say that 1 time out of 10, there will come a situation where a child will need to decide, a young adult will need to decide, am I going to stand with God's desire for my life, or am I going to side with the parental desire for my life? Now, this is a hard one, ladies and gentlemen, because Matthew 10, verse 34 to 39, Jesus, in that context of discipleship in Matthew 10, talks about, I didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword to divide family members one from another. Because ultimately, a believer or believers' allegiances have to be to the risen Lord. An individual's allegiance needs to supersede allegiance to a parent or parents. But here one needs to tread very, very cautiously and slowly, because fools rush in where angels fear to tread. There will come times where your decision will fly in the face of a parental design or a parental desire. Sometimes the parent would desire that the child becomes a doctor or a lawyer, right? Or a rocket scientist or an engineer. The child decides otherwise. Or the child decides to date and to marry someone that the parents do not approve of. And these issues need to be viewed very seriously in the light of allegiance to God. And when you obey God, you will pay. When you obey parents, you will pay. You see, it all depends on which side the chips land. As one kid said, Sir, what do you do when the chips are down? And the adult was very smart. The adult said, you eat them. But I'm not going to say you need to eat them. I would say on either side of the fence, whichever decision you make, if you make a decision in defiance of God, in fulfilling a parental desire or parental will, there would be consequences. As well as consequences that will roll when you do things God's way, in defiance of a parent's will or desire. So you have 2 key passages. One is Matthew 10, 34 to 39. And the second one is Luke 12, 49 to 53. And both passages map out that ultimately I've sworn an oath of allegiance to Jesus. If any man will come after me, let him take up his cross and follow me. Right? It's the denial of self and selfish desires and selfish will that I go up against. And there are challenges. And so this area is one that needs to be traversed carefully and cautiously. But unswerving obedience from the child to the parent is fitting according to chapter 3, verse number 20. Theo, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah. Well, you did say accurately this is a very, very tentative subject to talk about, but we need to have these conversations. And so thank you for sharing that. For those of you who've listened in this morning, you were listening to the Fifth Connection with Terry Martin and myself, are trying to navigate through this unfolding story in Colossians that have great bearing on our lives. And Terry, I appreciated the fact that you were talking about this child-parent relationship, and there's such a lot of tensions in relation to that. We will continue next Monday on this unfolding story, and we trust that you will have a blessed and good weekend. Terry, my brother, thank you as always.
Thank you, Theo. Thank you, listeners.
Appreciate that. We're listening to a song by Sandy Patty called Love Will Be Our Home.